Welcome back to the Green Crescent 5th International Congress of Technology Addiction. The chairperson of our first session will be the president of country Green Crescent, India, Mr. Sajju Hamid, joined again by most valuable speakers. Firstly, allow me to briefly introduce our session speakers. Professor Matthew Brownie, joining from Australia, works at the School of Health, Medical and Applied Sciences of Central Queensland University. Today, he is here to discuss his presentation titled SFD6 Health Utility Weights for Gambling Problems and Harms Using a Propensity Score Weighting Paradigm. Associate Professor Sally Gainsbury, joining from Australia, is the director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Centre at the University of Sydney and carries out studies at the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney. Today, she is here to discuss her presentation titled Website Design Features, the Role of Social Cues, Regulatory Cues, Gambling Activity and Consumer Protection practices in risky online gambling. Professor Atul Ambekar, joining us from India, is faculty at the National Drug Dependence Treatment Center of All India Institute of Medical Science. Today, he is here to discuss his presentation titled COVID-19 and Addiction Treatment, Perspective from India. At the end of the session, the speakers have been reserved 5 minutes each during which to answer questions from the audience. Now I leave the floor to Mr. Sajju Hamid. Sorry if I pronounce wrong, Mr. Hamid.
Kindly unmute me. Okay.
Do you hear me?
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome.
Welcome to see you and our speakers here in our Congress. It's so privilege and honor to us.
Thank you.
The floor is yours, Dr. Sajju.
Respected leaders of Green Crescent International and Turkey Green Crescent, my respected co-panelists and participants of this August session of the 5th International Congress on Technology Addiction. At the outset, I sincerely thank you for honoring me and the Green Crescent India, one of the youngest Green Crescent baby in the International Green Crescent family. Today, we are with a stellar panel of experts, including one proud son from our own India. We have a myriad of topics in this session, covering from health economics and biostatistics to social psychology and addiction psychiatry. So we are receiving a heavy intellectual feast after this lunch. So we are be attentive, overcome all your postprandial hyperglycemia. And we have eminent Professor Matthew Brown, a renowned health economist and from the School of Health and Applied Sciences, Queensland University, Australia, and Ms. Sally Gainsbury, the eminent psychologist and director of Gambling Treatment Research Center, Sydney, Australia, and our own professor of psychiatry and a walking encyclopedia on addiction psychiatry, Professor Atul Ambekar of All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and he's a member of expert panels in many WHO and UN panels. Hearty welcome to you. So the first presenter is Professor Matthew Brown, and our topic is short form 6-dimension health utility weights for gambling problems and harms using a propensity score weighting paradigm. And many of you may be familiar with this quality adjusted life years and also disability adjusted life years. And this international tool is adopted for measuring the effectiveness of healthcare interventions. And we are awaiting this rich feast from Professor Matthew Brown. Hearty welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay.
Yes.
Very good. All right, I'll just share my slides, I guess. And hello, everybody from Australia. It is evening here, but it's very good to be attending. Sorry, I think I'm ready to go. Okay, so the title of my talk has already been read out a couple of times, but I guess it's worth saying again. This is, in fact, about using the SF6D, this well-recognized measure of health utility, as a kind of ground truth for understanding gambling problems and gambling harms. So just quickly first to mention funding and collaborators. This is supported by the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation, and this research has been done with other members of my team, as well as Professor Steve Begg. And just a funding statement there. So we've been thinking about this. Sorry, just a bit of background noise there. So we've been thinking about this quite simple question for some time, which is, how bad is having gambling problems? Well, we might all agree that having, say, a problem gambling severity index category of problem gambler is unquestionably bad. But how bad is it relative, say, to other conditions? Is being a moderate risk gambler really associated with a decrement to one's quality of life, or are they merely at risk of perhaps encountering harm sometime in the future? So it's a relatively simple question, but it's a question that is of current debate in the gambling field and is perhaps unresolved. So the fundamental issue here is one of measurement. So screens of problem gambling, or gambling harms for that matter, have no intrinsic metric. That is, they can be used to assign people to some kind of category, which there can be some justification for enforcing some kind of categorical boundaries. But we have no real index of how much somebody is being harmed, how much their life is being affected. So in order for us to answer this question, we really need to ground these population screens to some kind of external measure. Well, fortunately, of course, the public health perspective and population health offers a variety of tools that we can use and methodologies to attempt to answer this question. So these go by a variety of names, such as self-reported well-being, general quality of life, or health in the most general sense. And if we focus on health utility in particular, as a statistician, I find this very appealing because it aims to produce this metric that is bounded between 0 and 1. So we can talk, if one has a health utility of 0, then we say that is a life not worth living. And if we, sorry, just checking my chat here. Sorry, it's just getting told I'm moving out of frame, so I'll try to stay in the center of the frame. Health utility of 0 is associated with a life that's not worth living, as bad as it can possibly get, essentially. 1 reflects pretty much optimal health and well-being. And then we can talk about decrements to sort of, which pushes people's health utility up and down on that scale. So from a philosophical point of view, this gives us a way to weight or compare various conditions. It allows us to measure outcomes of, say, policy changes or various kinds of interventions in terms of a metric for people. And also we can add this metric up so we can talk about it in aggregate, how much people are being affected either positively or negatively. And also from a definitional or conceptual point of view, I like this very much as well, because it allows us to really give a clear definition of what is gambling-related harm. There are various definitions floating about, but if we talk about it as a decrement to health utility, then it has a clear operationalization. We know what it means and we know how to measure it. Sorry, here we are. Okay, so briefly, the theoretical model that we generally work from is that we understand that there are various, the primary risk factor for gambling-related harm is behavioral addiction, which itself can have risk factors that's associated with excessive consumption, which in turn leads to gamblers losing money, excessive amounts of money that they cannot afford, and also a loss of time. This comes from the definitions. And we can think of these as those causal mechanisms. There is perhaps also a direct causal mechanism from addiction itself, which is not a very favorable state of mind to be in, of course. Now, one of the challenges with gambling, perhaps more so than any other health-related condition, is that it is associated with a very broad number of specific symptoms or specific indicators that one is being harmed. So as we see here, we have various domains from financial, relationships, psychological, health-related ones, physical health, that is, and also work study and antisocial activities. So these have been enumerated before by others and also by ourselves. So I guess the first point is that there's a large number of them, and they're very diverse, and the particular pattern of symptoms that one might experience can be very dependent on one's state of life. For instance, if one is single, doesn't have children, then that's going to lead to a differing pattern of relationship-related harms than if one is married with children. It also creates a measurement problem because there are so many, and we don't know how to combine them together or somehow add them all up into some kind of index of how much one is being harmed. But again, this concept of health utility or health-related well-being is helpful for us because it provides a single unified outcome that, from a theoretical point of view, all of these negative impacts can contribute to one degree or another. So if we transpose these phenomena into the population and think about what we would expect to see on a population level, then there's a sort of a general rule we see across many different areas, which is that you tend to see like an 80-20 rule, or a kind of distribution where you have a small number of people who are being affected a very great deal, a moderate number of people who are affected a bit less, and a large number of people who are affected at a relatively low rate. So if we think about the impacts, if we think of all the people in the population who are being impacted on the x-axis here, and we order them from least affected to most affected in terms of negative impacts of gambling, and then the graph of the impact of quality of life probably looks something like this. So I just want to emphasize this is just a theoretical, conceptual model, not one that is grounded in data. But we see a similar kind of pattern with many kinds of issues. For instance, alcohol abuse, we will see a small number of people who have very severe alcohol-related problems, but they're a much smaller number than the much broader number of people who might be affected negatively to one degree or another by alcohol misuse, or be affected, say, by a car accident or violence or something else that is associated with it. The large proportion of these incidents and impacts are not necessarily going to be associated with those who have a full-blown addiction to alcohol. So the same is true for many conditions, and I would say including gambling. So one of the issues, this has relevance in terms of how we target our policy directives and our interventions. Should we be focusing on people at the pointy end, the most severe end, or should we be perhaps treatment solutions, or should we be looking at more broad-scale interventions which are more targeted towards the longer end of the tail here? So this is related to a concept, again, from public health, which is called the prevention paradox. And the prevention paradox I'll probably won't do it justice off the top of my head, but it's essentially the paradox whereby the larger proportion of impacts is actually attributable to those who are affected less. So transposing that idea to here, it's basically saying that that area of B, that the people who are below some threshold of which is somewhat arbitrary, that we might call severe, is larger than the area of impact attributed to the area A. So again, this focusing on quality of life and health utility is really important again, because thinking about such questions doesn't make any sense unless this y-axis is a proper metric where we can actually compare different values, different levels of impacts or decrements to health utility, and where the differing tick marks, if you like, on that y-scale are comparable to one another. Because if the scale is off, and if it's just some arbitrary numbering, such as the numbers we get from the PGSI, then we cannot answer these kinds of questions. So this problem applies to the Problem Gambling Severity Index, which is just a Likert scale. You add it up, you get scores between 0 and 27. Usually these are not interpreted directly, and rather people focus on the categories such as non-problem gambler, low risk, moderate risk, and problem gamblers. The same problem affects other screens, and there are a variety of them about, including the short gambling harm screen, which my group developed, which has 10 items. They're just treated in a binary sense. We treat the symptom as either present or absent, and scored, yielding score 0 to 10. But once it doesn't have formal categories, but it still has the same problem. We don't know how to interpret the numbers. If somebody scores a 2, well, we can say, well, that's probably worse than scoring a 0, and probably not as bad as scoring a 7. But how bad is scoring a 2? Is it something that's important? Is it something we need to worry about? So this is, so returning to the question of how bad is it to have gambling-related harms or having gambling problems, we've looked at it for some time. A few years ago, we did some elicitation, burden of disease elicitation protocols, the time trade-off protocol, and the visual analog scale, and came up with some estimates here that are shown on the graph on the left. We, using a different methodology in a different study, we used a self-report measure, the Personal Wellbeing Index, where we focused on associations. So that in this case, we are actually we are getting self-reports directly from people in these different gambling categories and looking at the mean differences in their personal well-being while controlling for a number of covariates. But this was, while we did our best to do control for confounding variables, it was a relatively casual, I would say, analysis. And on the left-hand side here, while we used standard burden of disease elicitation protocols, there are a number of methodological limitations there. For instance, we don't know the degree to which people might have some kind of response bias. Perhaps they are over-attributing problems to gambling and so on. So these issues have been discussed in the literature. So what I'm going to present to you today is the latest in our attempts to get to the bottom of this. We've used a method called propensity score matching and control. And this is a method that's, again, come from the public health methodology literature. And the basic idea here is that we acknowledge that we cannot do a controlled experiment, because that's what we'd really like to do. If we didn't have any ethical problems or practical problems, we would somehow give people, a set of people, gambling problems or gambling harm somehow. We would randomly allocate them to that condition. We would have a control group, and then we would conduct that comparison. Naturally, we cannot do that. So what we try to do with this method is we do the next best thing, which is we do our best to enumerate all the risk factors that lead one to increase one's likelihood have gambling problems or experience harm. These could be demographics, socioeconomic status. There's a whole bunch of risk factors known in the literature. And then we use that to do a case weighting scheme and also a case elimination scheme to try to match these samples as much as possible. So I'm avoiding going into the technical details in this presentation. I could refer you to some publications which describe it if you like after the talk. But the idea here is that through case matching and case weighting, what we end up with is a treatment group, a group that has harms or problems, and a comparison group, which after weighting have essentially the same propensity to be in that higher risk category. And then, so that's the propensity model. Now, in the second stage, this is the causal model, which is what we really want to do, is to understand, well, what's the direct impact on of gambling harms and problems on health utility. There's a few different ways we can measure that. In the present study, we're going to focus on the SF6D. And in doing that, to be super cautious, we can also control for a number of comorbid conditions that we know are often co-occur with gambling problems, and we know also impact on people's health and well-being. So I tend to think of this as probably the most conservative approach to estimating these disability weights. It's certainly the most conservative and cautious approach that has been done in the gambling literature so far. So in this study, we recruited 2,600 or so Australian participants. So we aimed for about 50% in the control group who were non-problem gamblers. And we aimed for approximately equal representation across the other groups in terms of the PGSI. Because the PGSI gambling problems are highly correlated with gambling harms, those sorts of proportions are pretty well reflected for the short gambling harm scale, which we also analysed. And as I said, the first stage in the model was to estimate this propensity coefficients based on known exogenous risk factors. So we've done a literature review and we've reported that. Just to give you some indication of what these variables were: gender, country of birth, age, education, employment status, employment category, whether or not one has a disability. I won't read them all, but there's quite a few there. So these were useful to us because they were both exogenous, that is not very unlikely to be a pure outcome of the gambling problems, but rather a risk factor that is on the left-hand side of the model there. So after we do that, and we did match our samples as closely as possible on some of those demographic covariates, but of course we couldn't match them on every single known risk factor because we actually had to get them to fill out our survey and so on in order to know what their scores were. So after ending up with our two samples, and we call them the treatment group and the control group, again in keeping with the idea that we are emulating an experiment here, even though it isn't an experiment. Not surprisingly, we find that the people in the treatment group, that is those with gambling problems, are more likely to have, we estimate them to be more likely to have gambling problems based on their risk factors. So on the left-hand side panel here, panel A, we see the estimated probability on the y-axis there. These are histograms. So this is our data set. So we can see that sort of bump there at an estimated probability of about, getting towards 0.6. So that's for the treatment group. And we see for the control group there, the probabilities are lower. They're less likely to have gambling problems based on their covariance. So what that means is we don't have perfectly matched samples. So what the weighting design does is we do an inverse weighting based on the inverse of the probability of an estimated probability of having gambling problems or harms. And then in doing that, we can sort of match those two groups up in aggregate to kind of eliminate those covariate effects. So this, so on the right-hand side here, this actually is the propensity weights that we've calculated. Sometimes in these kinds of designs, people end up with very, very large propensity weights, like 20 or 50 or something like that. But in our case, fortunately, we didn't have overly large propensity weights, sort of maxing out around 5 or 6 there. Right, so that's a bit of the technical details. Now, I'm aware that the little numbers and text here of the model is too small to be easily seen, but I wanted to pop it up there before I zoom in to just give you a sense of what the causal model and the propensity model looks like. So for the propensity model, we estimate a whole bunch of these risk factors, which I just talked about, and on the two right-hand columns there, looking at both the short gambling harm scale and the PGSI, we controlled for a bunch of things, age, gender, and so on. But I think probably most importantly, we controlled for some of the big comorbidities that are known for gambling harms, such as having a mood disorder, a diagnosed anxiety disorder, and so on. But really what we care about in this great big model, from our point of view here, all of this stuff are nuisance variables. What we really care about is these estimated coefficients sort of in the red box there. So I'm just going to zoom in there. And just by the way, before I move on, notice that we also controlled for things like having a disability, drug use, smoking, and so on. So these are all things that are correlated with having gambling problems and can also affect one's well-being. So, this is a conservative analysis, because what we do is we don't assume that somebody who is smoking lots of cigarettes and also gambling, that they have a particularly bad health utility based on our self-reported SF6D. But we don't assume that is due to the gambling. Rather, we partial out those effects. But what that does is, of course, come at the expense of some statistical power. So moving into the results here, and as I said, we essentially performed the same analysis and this whole same procedure separately for gambling harms measured using the SGHS and for gambling problems using the PGSI. And what we found was that starting with the PGSI first, we found no significant effect for or difference between the health utility weights of the low-risk gamblers and the recreational gamblers. See, there's no stars next to the negative 0.005 there. After doing the propensity score weighting and controlling for all of those things that I mentioned. We did find significant effects for moderate risk and gambling problems. The overall magnitude of the effect for moderate risk gamblers was about half that, as for those with in the problem gambler category. And with the short gambling harm scale, we grouped those scores, even though we don't have a strong rationale for the grouping. Preliminary analysis we've done in previous studies suggests that a grouping or categorization of 1 to 2, 3 to 5, and 6 to 10 seems somewhat reasonable. And in fact, what we see here is if we look at so all of those differences were significant. That is, someone who is scoring just 1 to 2 on the SGHS has got a significantly lower health utility than somebody who is scoring 0. And this perhaps makes some kind of sense, given that the PGSI measures not just gambling harms, which we would say should be directly related to health utility, but it also measures aspects of behavioral addiction which are not necessarily directly related to health utility, at least in the short term. But the overall pattern of the decrements here are kind of similar to what we would see with the PGSI. Notice that we have like negative 0.108 here, pretty similar to the 0.099 for the PGSI and so on. The people in the moderate range are a little bit more than half of the most harmed group. and in the low group, about a third. In terms of the magnitude of the effect. The constant here of 0.836 or 0.832 is pretty typical for what we would see in Australian samples in terms of reasonably healthy people. Okay, so regarding the implications for the prevention paradox, which is not something of primary interest for us, but it seems to be a topic that is always of interest when we do these calculations for disability weights. We can do a very simple calculation. In actual fact, the short gambling harm screening was used in a recent population prevalence study of gambling problems and harms in Victoria, Australia. So we have population estimates of the total number of people scoring 1, scoring 2, scoring 3, and so on. I've left off the zeros here since we don't have a disability. We don't associate a disability weight with them. And if we just basically multiply that out, put in the 0.02 for the mildly harmed people, 0.06 for the moderately harmed, and a 0.108 for the most harm, and multiply them by the total number of people in the population and add those up. What we see is it's kind of a rough approximation to these disability adjusted life years, or that total aggregate burden of the impact across this spectrum of gambling harms. And what we see here is pretty much confirms what we've seen in previous studies, which is that there is meaningful impact across the spectrum. So it turns out, and this again we've seen this in previous work that we've done using different methodologies, that it seems that there's obviously an inverse relationship here between the number of that there's more people who are affected a little bit, and there are relatively few people who are affected a lot. And these two effects seem to counterbalance each other somewhat equivalently. So that's why we see this approximately equal impact across the spectrum. So yes. So look, we're pleased with this work in the sense that we see it as another useful step towards integrating gambling with the global burden of disease framework of the WHO. I think hopefully I'm okay for time. I'm just, I see I'm right at the end. So I'll finish up. So to conclude, there's a bunch of methodologies one can use to do this kind of job. No approach is perfect, including this one. As I said, this one tends to be maximally conservative, but we can triangulate results from multiple studies using different methodologies and find the common picture. I think the implications here is what we need is a mix of broad scale and targeted treatment measures across that spectrum of gambling harm. Thank you very much, and sorry for going a little bit over time. So,
okay, Hamid, did you connect it? I can see you right now. Sorry, yes, because of a technical problem, our chair just connected. Hamid, I am leaving the platform to you. Could you open your mic, please? You are muted.
Would you like me to start my presentation now?
Sally, the floor is yours, please.
Matt, do you mind taking your slides down, please? Thank you very much for that presentation.
Yes, thank you, Sally.
By the way, many thanks, Matthew.
Thank you.
Let me just share my screen here.
Hello, can you hear me?
So thank you.
You are connected right now, Hamid, but we are continuing with Sally. Could you please close your mic next time you moderating? Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today. I'm going to be sharing research looking at how the design of websites, which includes mobile apps, influences risky behavior, obviously with a focus on gambling in this case. And it's a number of studies looking at the role of social cues, regulatory cues, and how these interact with gambling activities and potential risk for online gambling. So I'm going to be looking at a number of different studies. It's been a body of work I've been looking at for the last few years, looking at how website design influences behavior, including how online gambling is associated with risk-taking, which consumers, how they select which gambling and including offshore sites to use, and how we can use design to influence positive behaviors as well. So first of all, the background and the motivation for this work is coming out of our lack of real understanding of how online risk-taking has real-world consequences, and that many people are really poorly adapted at making decisions online, and that all of our study of risk-taking and social psychology has primarily been conducted in face-to-face worlds, but that when it does come online, our intuitive sense of risk-taking is really compromised because we do rely heavily on social cues and contextual cues and the environment that we're in to make appropriate decisions. And that some of the aspects of the internet, the privacy, asynchronicity, anonymity, it leads us to disinhibited behaviors where we are more prone to taking risks online. Yet very few studies have investigated how the website design per se is influencing potential risky behaviors. This graphic here is from a public health campaign that went viral in New Zealand that was about encouraging parents and young people to be aware of the risks of, for example, in this case, online pornography viewing. So this is something that we've studied. And so I conducted a study with a research student, Sunny Nong, who spent some time in our lab. And she looked at an audit of different websites. So we looked at everything from entertainment to retail to hotels, including gambling, but also education, news sites, peer-to-peer content. And what we were looking at is what are the features, the social interaction are encouraged. So how do websites and apps actually, how are they built? What type of things do websites typically have on them to try and influence consumer behavior, to try and drive interactivity, to try and influence, in this case, purchasing behavior? Pardon me. And you can see the examples here from Amazon, a very popular retail site. There are so many different features that are encouraging socialization. So you can see there's consumer reviews with how many stars, how many people give each rating, and encouragement to write a review. And not only can you view all the reviews, around 300 in this case, but there's been a rating. The website has said these are the most important reviews to look at. It's information about how many people have purchased this product, about what other items were purchased when someone bought the product. So a lot of the information is actually not particularly relevant to the product itself, but it's all this social information that's trying to overcome any hesitation and provide a sense of normality and provide cues to individuals about how they should be making their purchasing decisions. So obviously we need to then look at what are the potential pressure points that are used. So in this indication, it's a hotel room, which it's saying there's only 5 rooms left. You know, the common aspects are time pressures. It's a limited time sale, or, you know, special rate is here. It might say how many people have recently purchased this room to influence social desirability. But there's no way for the consumer to actually understand the extent to which this information is accurate or not. That maybe the website just, is indicating there's not many rooms left. Maybe no one has purchased this room. It's all information that's provided, but without any ability for the customer to really verify that information. So when we look at then online gambling, we conducted a study, and this study I'm presenting as well, and Matthew Brown, who had just presented for us, was one of the co-authors on the study, where we looked at how online gambling behaviors are associated with harm. So it's a series of studies looking at, identifying where is the risky behavior, what is risky behavior, even defining that. So in this case, we defined risk by looking at the experience of negative consequences in relation to online activity. So we looked at the experience of fraud, of abuse, spam, malware, phishing, theft of personal information, and we asked around 2,000 Australians who were surveyed what types of harms they'd experienced and what types of activities they typically engaged in online. So everything from using forums to shopping. Obviously, we were looking in this case at gambling, but we also looked at gaming. So a range of different activities, and then we conducted the analysis to look at what was predictive of the experience of harm. So the results, and the full paper is available for you here, but the results in relation to gambling found that the use of online gambling sites, including the diversity, so the number of different sites and the frequency of using sites, was associated with the experience of negative consequences, in particularly the experience of abuse and harassment and targeted scams. So there was this risk activity, whereas engaging in this online gambling was associated with further negative outcomes. So we're starting to build a profile, and the next step in the research project was to look at what is different and unique about internet gambling compared to venue-based gambling, so we can start to identify what is driving the behavior, what are the potential harms that might be experienced, and how is the website, how it's set up, and in particular the structural characteristics of the internet gambling site really different to what we know in terms of our study and research of venue-based gambling. And obviously the structural characteristics are different in a number of ways. So the first is that the internet gambling has instant and convenient access with a low barrier. So if someone wants to gamble online, they can pretty much do it straight away with very few interruptions. There's no time taken to access or drive to a venue. And that means there's less that's going to interrupt that temptation or that impulse, which means that people who do have poor impulse control are more likely to engage in this activity. There are options to suit any preference. So if you don't, whatever type of gambling or gambling site you're interested in, there'll be an option to suit you. And critically, because it's associated with an account, there's a customized and targeted marketing, because you're constantly being tracked with information monitoring, and the operator can then send you personalized emails about the specific type of gambling you like, with personalized offers to encourage you back if you haven't been gambling for a little while. So there's lots of ways to personalize then your experience. But then, although there is this sense of socialization in some aspects of gambling in terms of being able to see the social cues, which I'll talk about later, there is this sense of anonymity. And we do know that this sense of anonymity is really impactful, and that we look at things like social learning theory, and social cues and social psychology more generally. As I've mentioned, really the influence of others has a strong impact on our sense of disinhibition and our risky behaviors. And gambling studies have shown that gambling in the presence of others encourages inhibition, whereas gambling by yourself encourages disinhibition. So it's important for us to think about how are people experiencing a sense of disinhibition in private online activities. Now, digital payments, obviously I could actually speak for a whole session talking about the impact of this, but we do know that when people are using electronic funds, they tend to spend more money than they would in a physical setting. And with the lack of socialization and non-gambling options compared to a venue, whereas you might be able to go for a coffee or have a meal or chat with someone or take a show, that these options aren't as readily available online. That internet gambling typically is faster with more betting options, and that the speed of play often can influence risk-taking. And as I mentioned, it can really manipulate what's actually presented. So in terms of the social cues or reviews or what information can easily be falsified. And as I'll come to, some illegal offshore sites have varying levels of consumer protection for individuals. So when we're thinking then about internet gambling, it sounds quite scary, but the studies have shown that internet gambling engagement in and of itself is not inherently associated with problem gambling. And that's really important for us to understand, because overall, simply using an internet gambling site has not been demonstrated to cause or be positively associated with gambling harms when we account for overall gambling intensity and involvement. So what we tend to find is that people who do gamble online do experience more harms, but it's likely that their harms are not simply caused by the fact they use an internet gambling site, but the harms are related to not only their internet gambling, but their extent of gambling overall, as well as their engagement with other gambling activities. So there's then been further studies that have looked at online gambling activities that are associated with harms. And one study we conducted with almost 1,000 Australian regular participants of internet gambling indicated that online electronic gaming machines, so online versions of slot machines, these were associated with problems. So it might not be that internet gambling per se is causal of harms, but there are some types of internet gambling that are more problematic than others. And that's when we have to get to the next question, which is, are there some types of gambling platforms or some structural characteristics of how gambling is provided that's associated with greater risk? So the next stage of our research was to look at what do we know about how customers actually select the different gambling sites that they use, because there's a huge variance in how gambling is provided to consumers. And again, in surveys that we've conducted, this is from Australian populations, we've found that consumers tend to select surveys based on how easy they are. So the ease of use in placing bets, in creating accounts, the extent to which people can bet in their own currency. There's a sense of familiarity there as well as ease. Promotional offers, the reputation, which is somewhat of an unknown quantity, but there is some thought about who the operator is, and the available products. And customers are not particularly concerned with consumer protection or responsible gambling. They're not particularly concerned with the dispute process or whether the site is licensed by a respectable authority. Now, this gives us an indication of potential risk there, because customers are selecting sites without thinking through what happens if something goes wrong. What happens if I do need to resolve something or I am defrauded in some way, which obviously is putting customers at greater risk. Now, offshore gambling sites are often thought about, and these are sites that are not regulated by the jurisdiction in which consumers are based. So and the sites might actually be acting in contravention to laws. So, for example, in Australia, it's against the law to provide online casino or pokies, slot machines, bingo, these games. It's not allowed to provide these to Australians, but you can see from the examples here, mentioning, new casino for Australians and emus, and it's very clear that these sites are marketing themselves illegally. And so the authorities have already blocked more than 260 different online sites, but there are many examples of sites simply offering their services to Australians anyway. And when we've done our surveys, what we found is that most consumers aren't actually aware if the site they're using are domestic or based on offshore. They actually don't know. They do have a preference for domestic sites, but they don't actually consider the information they need to. And the concerns with offshore sites is that they might not provide fair games. So the risk isn't only for the risk of developing gambling problems, because the sites might not have consumer protection features, which are things like the ability to set deposit limits or monitor your play. But they also might not protect consumers' personal information, so that someone might experience fraud or theft, or they might have their money stolen from their online gambling account. So there are risks because the consumer has no recourse if the site is not regulated in their territory. So when we asked Australians, how would you know if a site was licensed in Australia? The statements included things like they looked for a statement the site is licensed, they looked for the .com.au, they looked for the ability to bet in Australian dollars, the presence of a customer support number, or the presence of AU somewhere in the URL. And they did look for other things, including having an Australian flag on the site or having iconic Australian imagery, which unfortunately is pretty problematic because these are actually not accurate ways of identifying whether a site is licensed in Australia or not. And there are so many examples. Here you can see you can bet in different currencies. You've got an Australian flag. You've got Australian players welcome. This casino actually claims that it is certified registered Australian casino, which is not true. And so you have to then question if their claim about safe and secure banking methods is also true or not. Here's some more examples of AU somewhere in the URL, even though these are illegal sites. There's lots of examples of local customer support numbers, of Australian themes, even though these are all illegal offshore sites. So we've seen that Australians do prefer domestic sites. They don't know how to identify these. They don't look for the right information, and that other factors are more important. And they do seek out attractive offers and sites used by other people similar to them. So then we conducted the next study, which I'll present, which is an experimental study. So it's gone away from asking consumers about their actual gambling behavior to looking at, in this case, we had undergraduate psychology students, so not the most representative sample, but it's a start. And we had an experimental task to understand how people were actually selecting the sites that they were going to use. So we specifically wanted to know what would influence people's behavior. So, pardon me. We wanted to look at regulation, so statements by indicating a reputable versus a disreputable licensing authority. And then we wanted to look at social cues. So this included things like the number of active users, which are commonly stated, social proximity, which are things like someone similar to me. So in these cases, it might be the name of someone I recognize, not a specific individual, but that type of name is familiar. I know people with those sorts of names. And geographic proximity, which is also information that gambling sites display. So here you can have a testimonial from someone in a specific location within Australia. So you might say, oh, that's something like I know where that is. That's close to where I am. So these indicators of social and geographic proximity are commonly displayed on gambling sites to try and influence someone's likelihood to engage with that site. So we mocked up our own gambling sites. We also looked at the level of risk. So how much the odds were, just to control for people's risk-taking propensity. So we took this away. It wasn't designed to look like a real gambling site. Essentially, we designed this online platform with the university students where all the information was covered up, and people actually had to sort of scratch with their mouse and select what information they wanted to reveal before they made their choice. So this was then at the end, they could see all the information, but before they did that, we could actually measure what information were they looking for. So if they didn't bother to uncover that information, we knew that obviously that wasn't influencing their decision. So they could see the headings, and then they had to scratch to reveal what information was underneath. So this was a nice experimental way for us to get at what's that underlying information that people are really looking for. So then they would select which site they would prefer to bet with. Now, what we found, the study found that students were most likely to choose to play on gambling websites that indicated that they were regulated in a country with relatively strict licensing conditions compared to a country with less strict licensing conditions. So this is positive. It's indicating people do actually prefer somewhere that's reputable. And social information displayed also influenced people's choices. So students were more likely to choose to play on sites that had a greater number of users and users that were similar to them and in a similar location. Now, when the gambling website indicated it had a large number of users and it was regulated in a stricter jurisdiction, this increased the influence of both of these cues, so they complemented each other. And the regulatory information was important in guiding choices, particularly when the individual indicated they didn't have a good level of trust for the gambling site. However, the information about where the site was regulated became less important for guiding decisions when there was social information there. So it was less impactful when people could see that other users similar to them were there. And this really highlights the persuasive effect of that social information, which can so readily be faked by an online gambling site in guiding our decisions. We feel more confident using a website if we think people similar to us are using it as well. So the final study I want to present to you is showing us how can we actually use website design features to encourage protective behaviors, so things that are going to be useful in reducing risk. So this study that's recently been published we had around 32,000 online wagering customers from across 6 different online Australian wagering sites. And what we found was we were looking at deposit limits. So this is when someone sets a limit that stops them when they are gamble at that amount of time, so at that amount of money. So they can essentially set themselves a spend limit, and when they hit that amount, they're blocked from gambling for, say, the rest of the month. The most significant feature that increased the use of deposit limits, which was very, very low amongst players, only around 2% of players set limits, but when the policy change indicated that customers had to actually interact with the deposit limit setting feature, then this, you can see here in the graph, had a huge jump in how many people were actually setting deposit limits. So the change wasn't one that the gambling operator actually made themselves. It was a policy change that required the gambling operator to switch and ensure that every single customer at that point in time had to actively say, no, I don't want to set a limit, or yes, I do set a limit, compared to the previous months where the deposit limits were available on their websites, but the customers weren't required to engage with these. But it was very positive, because what we found was even though very few people did set limits overall, when they did, the deposit limits reduced their risky behavior. So their limit setters, their behavior was moderated over time. They had less intensity, less frequency. So they were still gambling, but they were gambling to a less intense way, which we know is more positive because it's less risky for the individual. So here's the takeaway points, and hopefully I'm within the time limit, and I'm very happy to take questions at the end of the presentation. And obviously the papers are all available. But thinking of putting all this together, thinking about how can website design features minimize harm for gambling. And obviously this applies to other types of behaviors as well, whether it's online gaming or shopping. You know, how are these features, the socialization features and the risk-taking features, all influenced by the design cues? So we've recently, my colleagues and I have written a framework where we've encouraged regulators and policymakers, as well as industry representatives, to take greater responsibility for the responsible site and app design. This has been something that's largely been ignored by industry and policymakers, thinking about, what games are you allowed to provide or what types of gambling activities, but not how you provide it and how you present it and the other information that's surrounding that's very influential. This is something that typically hasn't been part of policy and regulation, but has a huge impact on consumer behavior and the extent to which individuals might engage in risk-taking propensity and the development of gambling harms. So what we need then is the reverse of potentially what's happening. If you think of all those Amazon reviews and stars and feedback tools, what we need is to use similar design techniques to normalize the use of protection tools. So things like messages or statements that say, the majority of people on our site set deposit limits, or messages sent to people saying, do you know that people who set deposit limits have a really, a good experience? So trying to normalize and encourage everyone to engage with consumer protection tools as a normal aspect, and to encourage people that people similar to them use consumer protection tools, gamble in a positive way, and encourage the responsible or the protective behaviors that you want to see, and signify those with cues. But pardon me. where there are cues around regulation, that these need to be much more noticeable, and we need to encourage consumers to look for this information to know what is an accurate way of identifying the regulatory sites and licensing authority, and that encourage people to seek this information out by making it much more prominent. What we do need a lot more research in this area. We need to know which type of design nudges to encourage protection tool use. I am doing some more research with my team and looking at how do different types of consumers respond, because obviously there's no one single type of individual and consumer. We need to look at the differences between different consumer groups. So I want to acknowledge the funding received from the Australian Research Council for supported a lot of this research, as well as Responsible Wagering Australia for providing data and support for the deposit limit study. These slides will be available, but there's lots of references here of what I've presented and some associated studies. I also want to mention that I've recently concluded season 2 of the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series with all of the past episodes on YouTube and on the Sydney University Technology Addiction Team website. And we have a lot more content on the topics that I've presented on today about reducing harm online. But my contact details are here. If you don't have a chance to ask me specifically a question during this event, I'm very happy to receive any emails to hear from you on Twitter or to reach out in other ways as well, and to share the slides if it's been of interest. But hopefully that's slightly within time, and I'm looking forward to any questions towards the end of the webinar. So thank you very much.
It was an excellent presentation.
I'm here.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Hamid, do you hear me? Are you here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you, Dr. Sally. I am now going to the next presentation. We'll be discussing the questions after the whole presentation. Now I invite Professor Dr. Atul Ambedkar, the Director of National Drug Treatment Center, New Delhi, and he's the chairman of the addiction psychiatry in the Indian Psychiatric Society, and he's also the capacity building trainer for all of Indian psychiatrists and all of the medical professionals in India. Hearty welcome to you for the presentation, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Hope I am audible.
Yes, sir.
After these two very stimulating and academically rich talks by Matthew and Sally, I am going to talk about something slightly different. The talk number 1 is not focused only on behavioral or technology addictions, but addictions in general. And also considering that all of us throughout the world are going through this unprecedented crisis called COVID-19 pandemic, I'm going to talk about its effects on the addiction treatment sector in India in general. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to narrate this story of what all we went through in India, and hopefully there are some lessons there for all doctors, all psychiatrists, all health professionals trying to help people struggling with addiction problems. So basically, COVID-19 in India, the numbers are there for everyone to see. And for last few weeks, about 2-3 months or so, we have been dealing with a very, very serious second wave of COVID-19 pandemic, of which for last 2 weeks seems to have shown some signs of settling down. So we are taking some little bit of breather here for last 2 weeks or so. But in this second wave, things were really, really not good for India. First wave, unfortunately, was not so serious, but the fear and the response to the first wave in the form of lockdown was much more intense early in the course of the epidemic, which means I'm talking about March, April, May, June 2020. But apart from this, India has been facing another epidemic, and that's epidemic of drug use. So if we look at the overall substance use disorder numbers in India, they are quite mind-boggling. but that's expected because we are one of the largest populations in the world as well. So we have about 57 million people with alcohol use disorders in India. But most surprising numbers are the numbers of people with opioid use disorders. In fact, India's opioid use prevalence is almost 3 times that of global average. Fortunately, or at least not so unfortunately, the large majority of people who use heroin in India use it by a non-injecting route. So our people who inject drugs numbers are just about 800,000. About 9% of them are affected with HIV. And even in the pre-COVID times, we have a very, very large treatment gap. So in terms of the proportion of people who require treatment for drug use disorders or all kinds of addictions and the number who are actually able to access these services, there is a large gap. Particularly considering our serious opioid epidemic, the coverage with what is known as opioid substitution treatment or medication assisted treatment in the form of buprenorphine or methadone, that has been quite inadequate. We have had largely buprenorphine in India, which is very widely available. There are some methadone centers, but they mostly used to rely only on the daily observed treatment modality, which means the patient has to walk every day to collect their doses. That was the situation before COVID. So as soon as this advent of COVID-19 pandemic and the measure to respond to it in the form of nationwide lockdown, as soon as that was announced, we realized that there were immediately 2 kinds of challenges for people who use drugs. One was that because of these measures, there were serious restrictions on availability of alcohol and other drugs. Illegal drugs as well as legal substances like alcohol, because of lockdown, was simply not available for people to consume. This was true for people who are occasional recreational users as well as people who are physically dependent upon them. And we all understand that for people who are physically dependent on alcohol and other drugs, situation can be really ghastly. Also, because of lockdown, there were challenges in accessing treatment and support services. The movement, the commuting, that was difficult. And even the health services, a large amount of health and welfare resources were diverted to care and protection of COVID measures. So that it was a sort of double whammy for people affected by alcohol and drug use disorders. So the first challenge as soon as this lockdown came into announcement for us, the addiction psychiatry community, was to deal with the issue of alcohol withdrawal. And soon as within few days, weeks, we started looking at large numbers of people flocking health services with unprecedented levels of alcohol withdrawal. This was serious enough to be picked by general media in the form of news items, as well as some kind of research documentation and academic publications that also came true, that also arose out of this kind of situations. So it was very clear in the early months of the early weeks of the lockdown itself that we had to do something to help people affected by severe alcohol withdrawals. And hence, we started immediately working on these issues and started making, first of all, a large amount of resource and publicity material in the forms of documents, infographics, videos, largely aimed at the general public, giving appearances on the mass media of how alcohol withdrawal can be tackled. So, of course, understanding that serious alcohol withdrawal requires medical interventions and people staying at home will not be able to access it. For this, we required capacity building of our health professionals at a much larger scales. Considering the federal nature of polity in India, we immediately worked with the union government and sort of encouraged the Union Ministry of Health to send an advisory to all the state governments. And fortunately, in May 2020, all the state governments in India received this kind of advice from the union government, which gave them information about what should be the public health response to the risk of serious alcohol withdrawals, what kind of treatment guidelines are there in place, what's the role of specific medications in order to ensure that these medications are accessible and available to patients, organizational issues and healthcare delivery, and capacity building of health professionals. So through this, the idea was to sensitize and make aware all the state governments on the emergency measures which had to be required to deal with alcohol withdrawal. Simultaneously, there was also the challenge of dealing with internet use, gaming, and all these issues also started surfacing. So this is one of the studies which we conducted. Our colleagues conducted on gaming behavior of college students, and even in these times, because of lockdown, because of increased work from home and increased screen time that people were experiencing, naturally the risk of online gaming and gambling also increased. So this was one such small studies, and I'm sure most of the studies have been conducted, and some of them are in the pipeline of publication. However, for the industry, for the gaming, the gambling, as well as the technology industry, this has been seen as a windfall. So basically, they see this as an opportunity to expand their business. And there are plenty of newspaper and news media articles about how this could be a business opportunity to enhance, little realizing the kind of public health risks associated with it. However, we as the addiction psychiatry community, we understood this particular issue. Indian Psychiatric Society, as well as other kinds of experts, they have started developing guidelines and disseminating these guidelines for screen use. On this particular issue, I think, but all these efforts will not be enough. What we require is more kind of normative guidelines coming from something responsible global agency such as WHO. So many years back, WHO did come up with some kind of a guideline recommending or telling people throughout the world that more than 2 standard drinks per day is actually a measure of at-risk drinking. So that kind of guideline, that kind of normative recommendation would be very helpful in terms of screen use, gaming also. Another big challenge was patients who were on opioid agonist treatment or methadone treatment. So we know our group has been talking about for a very long time the challenges of making this treatment available at a large scale in India. There are many reasons behind this inadequate availability of treatment. And one of the important reasons is inordinate amount of regulations over availability of medications such as methadone and buprenorphine. So we have about 2.8 million people with opioid use disorders, out of which about 850,000 are people who inject opioids take opioids by injecting route. Methadone so far before pandemic was available only as daily observed treatment. Buprenorphine also was largely available only as daily observed treatment. At a smaller scale in some places, it was available as take home, but that too for limited duration, say ranging from 1 or 2 weeks per patient per visit at the maximum. So these were challenges even in the pre-COVID times in making this treatment available and accessible. As soon as this pandemic arose, we understood that our patients will find it very difficult to visit their hospitals every day, as well as doctors and nurses in these hospitals and clinics will also be at risk of frequent exposure. And hence it was necessary to minimize this exposure. And in order to do that, we had to have some kind of modification and reforms in the guidelines, in the dispensing procedures for opioid agonist treatment. So we immediately worked with relevant authorities for the government drug treatment clinics, which are in place under Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, for the National AIDS Control Program, as well as in the private sector for Indian Psychiatric Society. Our group immediately drafted guidelines, circulated and disseminated, and got them, very importantly, got them approval and implemented very soon in the days of pandemic. The general message for all these guidelines was that the services must continue irrespective of the pandemic, ensuring that patients and staff remain safe. They continue to receive services, yet they remain as much as possible not exposed or unexposed to the risk of COVID-19. And for this, in general, the regime was to be more liberal in dispensing, more take-home medicines. So what we did with these kind of guidelines is that the buprenorphine that started being available to people for a much longer period, up to 3 to 4 weeks at one go. Even methadone, which till this period, till before April 2020, methadone was never available at a large scale as a take home. We started implementing even methadone also as take home. And this, in fact, was noticed at many places in the world. And this will be, this sort of was covered by the international media as well. Fortunately, we were able to advocate with the authorities for having these kind of reforms. Pictures just showing some glimpses of our opioid substitution treatment with buprenorphine clinic, our first ever mobile methadone maintenance clinic. In fact, my colleagues have just published their research paper in WHO Bulletin, the most recent issue of their implementation experience with India's first mobile methadone dispensing clinic. And this clinic also has now started dispensing take-home methadone. Fortunately, what we found was that irrespective of this take-home methadone, and there were so many concerns earlier, heavens have really not fallen. So there has been no significant amount of diversion or overdose or any kind of risk. So with proper education, proper systems in place, it should be possible to be much more liberal in dispensing and improve access to our treatment services is one of the lessons that we have learned from this experience. Another challenge was to have capacity building for the health professionals. And for this also, we immediately started using the information technology, started organizing webinar. More importantly, very soon, within the first few weeks of the pandemic itself, we developed an online training portal. So any doctor, any health professional could just visit this particular portal, a National Addiction Treatment Training, and get themselves registered and start receiving and go through the modules at their own convenience. So these are not really interactive webinars, but these are those online systems which people can receive for their own capacity building at their own leisure, with their own convenience. Similarly, a large number of online events were organized to bring all health professionals, addiction health professionals on the same page. Simultaneously, it was also important to keep a tab on the situation and monitoring of these various responses which were put in place. And hence, we started collecting regular monitoring data as well. I'm not going into those numbers at this moment. That would be too boring. But in general, what we found was that alcohol as well as illicit drugs, that they still continued to remain available even during the lockdown, though slightly at a higher price. So in other words, the belief which our colleagues in the drug law enforcement sector had, that very stringent degree of law enforcement can create a drug-free society, was really not substantiated with these claims. So even by most stringent of movement restrictions possible, drugs continued to enter, drugs continued to remain available. What we also found was that there was slight reduction in footfall at all treatment facilities, which might be more of a reflection of not reduced treatment demand, but really not reduced means of reaching to treatment centers. Also, very importantly, as I was saying earlier, we hardly found any instance of large-scale diversion of take-home buprenorphine or methadone. So in other words, even in the post-pandemic period, it appears that a much more liberal access to these treatments is going to be a much better public health strategy. Simultaneously, a big sort of a reform which also came into being in India in these days, like most of other places in the world, was more emphasis on telehealth. So telemedicine practice guidelines were immediately published by Government of India, which unfortunately did not pay adequate attention to treatment of all mental health concerns, including the addiction treatment. And hence, the Psychiatrist Society of Indian Psychiatrist Society, they came up with telepsychiatry operational guidelines. So whereby telehealth services could be used to provide psychiatric help for people for various mental health consultations. Unfortunately, while all these measures are in place, there are systems in place whereby patients can be given online consultation, online guidelines. The issue of prescription and those prescriptions being honored by the pharmacies, that still remains slightly controversial. So quite a few medications which we would like to prescribe at a distance from remote locations to be honored by the pharmacist, those systems are still not in place, and hence all those medicines which we want to be prescribed through telehealth, that's still not possible. So most medicines which we use in addiction treatment, those which are categorized as narcotic or psychotropics, are not allowed to be prescribed through telemedicine. And hence we believe that advocacy as well as technical tools, technical guidelines on this particular issue is still a work in progress. In fact, we published this particular paper in one of the Indian journals, whereby we strongly advocated how some of these important medications used for the treatment of addictions, both for alcohol as well as for opioids, how they can also be utilized through telehealth. They can also be made access and made available to patients through telemedicine or telepsychiatry tools, of course, with all due precautions and documentations in place. So to conclude, we know the worst is still not behind us. There may still be third wave in India. Let's hope that situation remains stable everywhere in the world, but we really don't know which way the pandemic is going to turn. We also are not really sure what's going to be the drug use situation in the post-pandemic world, how severely, how adversely this pandemic is going to affect the mental health concerns throughout the world, as well as alcohol and drug use concerns. People who use drugs, they remain vulnerable in many different ways, and hence this is the appropriate time to start reimagining all the policies which govern addiction treatment services. In general, we want is more liberal regimens, more accessible treatment services to people everywhere they are. It's also a good opportunity for operational research and implementation science, and we have started conducting some such documentation. Some of these are in pipeline. In all this while, involvement of key stakeholders, which means our patients as well as policymakers, that's going to be very crucial. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be happy to take any questions now, as well as I can be contacted through these online mediums. Thank you for this opportunity once again.
Thank you, Atul sir, for the comprehensive presentation of the community mental health program led by you and the Indian Psychiatric Society and AIMS and ENHANCE in India. I am also a beneficiary of that. I am a psychiatrist from Kerala and also a public health activist, Assistant Director of Health Service in Kerala. So thank you all the panelists for the excellent presentation. It was a really stimulating presentation. Now we have three questions for this panel. These queries are for separately for three panelists, and you can listen to these queries, and some of the queries you can the other panelists also can answer later in their slot. Each panelist will be getting 5 minutes for the answer. So the first question is to Professor Matthew Brown. You mentioned very impressive and stunning statistics. What about the qualitative studies or mixed method studies?
Yeah.
Do you conduct qualitative projects or researches or mixed methods studies in gambling? And what is the relationship between gender and gambling disorder or addiction? And what do you think about women gamblers' experiences? And based on your studies, have you ever developed a treatment model for gambling disorder or addiction?
Yep. Yes. So the answer is yes. We do mixed methods and qualitative studies. The project that I presented on actually does have a qualitative component, but what I could speak to in the time was just a small part of it. So we are planning. We're actually in the process of interviewing affected gamblers and concerned significant others or their family and so on across those spectrums to do another kind of grounding of those numerical measures. And yeah, in gambling research generally, there is a big emphasis on qualitative work. Regarding gender and gambling problems, I might just share this with you really quickly, if you could see it. This is actually a summary of the rates of moderate risk and problem gambling prevalence across the lifespan for males in blue and females in red. This is from actually a collated data set, about 60,000 cases from all the population prevalence studies in Australia over the last few years. So you can see there quite nicely the difference between men and women. There is a very strong effect, basically, with young men being at greater risk. This is almost certainly due to their propensity to behave in a rash, impulsive manner, a propensity which tends to go away as you start getting towards my age and older. With women, the profile is entirely different. There's a tiny little bump for very young women, but we see a little bump both for women and men, but more apparent for women in middle age, actually, and slightly older. And there are probably some interesting sociological reasons for that. The third question, no, I don't specialize in questions regarding treatment. There are other researchers who work on that.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation and answers. Now the next question is to Madam Sally Gainsbury. How did the pandemic affect the internet gambling, and what is the danger behind internet gambling? And some research mentioned about gambling as a hidden addiction. Gambling is mentioned as a hidden addiction. The harms of addictive substances like tobacco and alcohol appears on the packages. Should the harms of the internet gambling appear on the gambling websites? And based on your studies, what is your opinion about it? This question is for Professor Sally Gainsbury.
Thank you. So the pandemic has impacted internet gambling, obviously with the lockdowns in many countries or forced restrictions. People have gravitated to online engagement with a range of activities, including internet gambling, because venues were physically closed. At the same time, there was a restriction on things like sporting events. However, the online casinos or gaming activities were relatively unaffected. So international research does suggest that globally internet gambling has become more common, and that's more people opening up accounts and trying it. We still don't know, however, that her research really hasn't indicated whether this has resulted in greater harm to people. Unfortunately, some people who are at most risk, so the people who are experiencing problem gamblers, were indicated in several research studies to be more likely to increase their internet gambling. So it's likely that the pandemic has contributed to some increased internet gambling related harms. Obviously, because of the privacy of internet gambling, it can be something that's hidden from people, because you can be gambling in the same room as someone, but if they can't see your screen, they might not know about this. So there is a level of hidden and secrecy around internet gambling that can make it quite difficult for people who are experiencing harm, or for significant others to know about internet gambling. So there is some danger there. And it is an onus on regulators and the gambling industry to increase consumer awareness of risks. So to encourage consumers to understand the risks of gambling online, as well as the risks of gambling offline, using increasing informed consent. So essentially that means that individuals have to understand that there's risks to their behavior and the risks of internet gambling before they can really make it an appropriate decision to engage with that product. So there is a greater onus required from policymakers and regulators and governments who tax and often profit quite substantially, or at least receive that taxation income from gambling, as well as the gambling operators, to take greater efforts to educate consumers about the risks and to encourage protective behaviours like setting a deposit limit. And then the website should be designed and used in ways that do normalise more positive behaviours and limit setting, activity statements, timeouts, and to discourage risky gambling. And that the part of that is certainly increasing consumers' awareness that there are risks to gambling, that their gambling can get out of control and that they need to take specific efforts. But the onus should not be just on the individuals, that there really should be a greater onus. And part of this stakeholder framework that I've been presenting with my colleagues is talking about how the industry and the regulators need to take greater responsibility and not simply say, well, we put a statement on our website, so, you know, it's up to the consumers and individuals to be aware, that there is a greater onus of the operators and the regulators and policymakers to ensure that consumers are more actively aware of the risks and are able to use that information and to moderate their behavior at appropriate levels.
Thank you so much for your thought-provoking answers. Now it's turn of Professor Atul Ambedkar, sir. What is the relationship between gambling disorder or addiction and the other addictions? And what is the difference between online gambling treatment and gambling treatment? Also, another question for was have you developed any treatment model specific for gambling? Professor Atul Ambedkar, welcome, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So, as we know, see, the issue of both gaming and gambling addiction, they are really sort of new to the Indian society. Gambling as a vice, as something undesirable, has been known in Indian civilization for literally thousands of years, right? There are mythological references to gambling and its adverse effects and so on. And hence, the whole overall sort of a projection of gambling as something bad has been there in the Indian society. That's why explicitly it has always been a sort of hidden and illegal phenomena in most places in India. In fact, very few states in India, in a very restricted manner, allow systematic legal form of gambling in the form of casinos. So that's number one about the Indian society and gambling. But does this mean gambling doesn't exist in India? Of course not. It does exist. It exists in the gray area. It exists under the surface, and hence it's much more difficult to detect as well as to act accordingly. It's the same as if you have bootlegged kind of alcohol, it becomes much more harmful. And that's why, and in gaming as such is a relatively new area everywhere. Increasingly, the lines between gaming and gambling are being blurred in India. There are online gaming sites which are now started offering provisions where you can invest some money and based upon your skills as well as some luck, you can sort of increase your money which you earn from those games. So that lines are increasingly being blurred in India. So with the kind of reforms, with the kind of changes which are taking place because of COVID-19, I can actually surmise that both gaming as well as gambling addictions, they are going to increase in Indian society. So that's the briefer answer. Then there are more philosophical kind of answers or more kind of neurobiological explanations of why there may be an association between substance use disorders as well as other kinds of behavioral addictions as well. There is common liability to addictions theory, which proposes that based upon certain genetic vulnerabilities, based upon certain other kinds of environmental exposures, the people may be vulnerable to either kinds of addictions, substances as well as gambling. So that's a larger kind of debate as well as discussion. Then there was a question about treatment and management. The treatment and management of all behavioral addictions throughout the world is still I would say evolving. The pharmacological treatment is still, there are no definite answers. People are grappling with various kinds of psychosocial interventions and behavioral interventions in order to help people with struggling with various kinds of behavioral addiction, including gambling and gaming addictions. So I believe this is one particular potential area for research where more efforts are required to find out effective pharmacological solutions for this. In India also, some institutions have started specialized clinics for treatment of all behavioral addictions, including ours at AIIMS. At NIMHANS Bangalore, such clinics are available. In Mumbai, such clinics are available, as well as quite a few in the private sector. Thank you.
The most popular Indian epic or Indian mythology shows the damages of gambling, no, sir? In Mahabharata.
Yeah.
In Kerala, we have the experience of the most popular dailies are carrying full page advertisement on gambling recently. Kerala.
Right.
Okay, Mr. Hamid, do you hear me?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your moderation, and I would like to thank you so much for the contribution all of our speakers. It was so informative session. Thank you so much.
Thank you all, sir.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Yes, now our panel is concluded with the Q&A session. See you at our next session on 3 p.m. See you all, I hope.
Thanks.